Welcome to the Books Applied podcast, presented by WSL Leadership. In this podcast, we talk about an awesome book and how to apply it to your work, sport, or life. I'm your host, Iggy Perillo. Thanks for joining me. On today's episode, we'll be talking about Reset, How to Change What's Not Working by Dan Heath. Dan Heath may be a familiar name to many of you. He was also the New York Times best-selling co-author of Made to Stick and Switch. And speaking of Switch, that book focused on how to make personal changes in your life, build new habits, do things of that sort. And Reset is sort of the similar genre of book, but really about organizational or systemic changes. So a little bit of a different scope, but maybe some familiar ground. And he references himself several times during this book, which is always classy. Overall, the book is super readable, super digestible. You can understand why he's a top-selling author out there in the world. And yeah, I found this book to be fascinating and incredibly interesting. Basically, this is how to change what's not working in your organization, in your system, in your team, kind of in bigger pieces of our world that we operate in. And he divides the book, it's super well organized, by the way, is divided into two major sections. Find leverage points is one section, which is where you uncover places where a little bit of effort can yield a disproportionate return. And the other part, section 2, is restack resources, which is reallocate time and effort and assets to push on those leverage points. So you figure out what to do, then you figure out how to do the thing that you're going to do. Again, the book is super well organized. If you are like, I just need the Cliff Notes version, you can grab this book. Every chapter has a beautiful chapter summary, one-page summary, and a couple pieces of additional information in there that will get you moving toward the content of each chapter. And it's divided up by section. The sections are divided up into chapters. The chapters, there are 5 ways to find leverage points and then 6 ways to restack resources. I'm going to cruise through them pretty quickly because I think they are super interesting ways to think about just how to change the systems we're in. I think we often find ourselves in an organization, in a system. Like, I don't think we're like, I'm in a system, but we find ourselves in an organization or working with a group of people. And it's just, we're not just getting things done like we want to, or we don't feel very effective, or we don't feel like we're making progress. So this book is about ways to do that, finding leverage points and restacking resources. So to dig into the finding leverage points, there are 5 ways that you identify these points where a little bit of effort is going to have a big result. Number 1, go and see the work, which sounds obvious, but observe up close the reality of the work. He tells these, again, the book is full of these amazing stories and research that he did and found out there. He tells this great story of a associate principal at a school. And the associate principal is like, oh yeah, we're great at this, we're great at this, we're great at this. And they're like, cool, well, why don't you follow around an average student for the day and see how it looks from a student's perspective, right? Go see the work, see what's happening out there. And they show this assistant principal, apparently. I think it was a news report. I haven't seen this myself, but he talks about how the assistant principal, the kid starts at PE class, goes to PE with the kids and is like running sprints and doing the things, and then goes sits in on all the students' classes during the day, eats lunch with the student, or in the student cafeteria, goes through all the classes in the afternoon with the student. And through this process, the student was in a remedial math program, and so had a double long math section versus a single long class for math. And the assistant principal was like, ooh, it is really tough to sit through a double long class of math, especially if you're struggling at math. And so the assistant principal got some insights into what we think we're doing that's super helpful may not actually be amazing because they went in there and saw what was actually happening on the ground. So that's part of going and see the work, like up close, engage with what it is. I think we make a lot of guesses around, here's what's happening. We just need to figure this out. But I know I've been in organizations where people are like, we need to build a new system when no one actually sees what the system is happening already, or sees the work from the perspective of a client or a user or someone that's on the other end of the stick, as they say out there. So thing 1 for finding leverage points was go see the work. Thing 2, consider the goal of the goal. Identify alternate pathways to your ultimate destination. And one of the examples they come up with this is people often make New Year's resolutions. Like, oh, I really want to, be more fit and have better fitness, which is a fine resolution. But what's the point? Like, why? To what end? They would ask. Like, the goal. If your resolution is to be more fit, well, why? What's the goal of that goal? Is the purpose of this section. They talk through someone who in that situation who wants to be more fit and blah, blah, blah. And then the second piece is, well, why do you want to have that goal? And so they tell the story of a woman who, she has this goal to be more fit. They ask her why. She basically says, oh, so I can spend more time with my kids, so I can do more things, so I can engage with my family a little bit more and not feel out of breath when I do that. And the next step was, well, what are 10 ways you can meet that goal that are different than going to the gym every day? Like her first plan was, I'm going to go to the gym every day. What are 10 other ways you can meet that goal to be more fit? But not actually the goal of being more fit, the goal of spending more time with your family and not feeling out of breath. And she's like, well, we could play board games. Like, that's a fun thing we like to do. We could do this other thing. We could do this other thing. So she basically came up with a list of other things she could do that would meet that same goal that were not go to the gym every day. Because she was looking at the goal of the goal, right? So not just, I need to go to the gym every day because I want to be more fit, but my purpose is to spend more quality time with my family and not feel out of breath. Well, what else can we do that would meet that goal? And she can do those things right now. She's like, oh yeah, we could play board games tonight. I don't need to go to the gym every day for 3 months in order to engage with my family in this way. I can do something right now. So the immediacy of the goal sometimes creates a really powerful leverage point where she could take action immediately. It was a woman in that story that did that. Next, we have study the bright spots. So if you look around at who is doing well, who is thriving in your immediate environment, looking into those bright spots of who's thriving, who's doing well, who's got it figured out, what are they actually doing? What are the factors of what they're doing that are having this big impact on why it's working for them, but maybe not working for someone else? And the story that went with this one of the stories was about an organization that had, I don't know, it was very businessy, to be honest. Like, oh, we need to have our underwriters write so many other things, blah, blah, blah. Well, some were doing a great job and some were not. Then they tried to figure out the behaviors of who was doing the great thing and who wasn't. And it was follow-up. They needed to follow up with clients more regularly. And so they looked at the people who were following up the most. They were the highest performers. And then they looked at, well, what do they do that helps them follow up the most? And like, oh, they have a system for scheduling. They have a blah, blah, blah. They're structured. They do all their follow-up calls on Mondays and Wednesdays, whatever it was. Meanwhile, the other folks who were struggling, not performing as well, were all over the place, didn't have an organized system. Not that they were actively disorganized, but the way they were doing it wasn't as systematic. The organization was like, oh, well, if we can even do this scheduling for you, we know you need to do follow-up. That's super important. Why don't we just schedule that for you so you don't even have to do that? So you just can pop in and do the actual connection with the people calls, which were an important part of this business. So by looking at the bright spots, they could identify the specific skills that were working for people and putting energy into making it easy to do the things that had the highest impact. Because for some people, it was already working. So that's studying the bright spots. And then you have to look in there and kind of figure out, they found a couple other behaviors that the bright spots were doing. They're like, that doesn't have as big of an impact. They happen to all be, eating carrots for lunch. Maybe not useful. Great, whatever. They didn't say that as a study, by the way. I don't think they got into their lunch choices. But you get the idea. There are meaningful things that are having a big impact for these bright spots. How can these meaningful behaviors be translated to everyone else? How can your bright spots train other people to engage in these same meaningful behaviors that drive big results? Next, target the constraint. So that is assess the number one thing that is holding you back. They have this long story of Dan Heath going to a drive-thru at a restaurant and being like, oh, the line is so long. Oh my gosh. But then he realizes once he gets in the line that it keeps moving, and he's out pretty quickly. Even though there's a ton of cars in line ahead of him, he moves through pretty fast, pretty pleasant experience. He's like, oh, this wasn't just sitting around for 2 hours, 10 minutes waiting. It was like I rolled forward for 10 minutes, got my stuff, and I was on the way. And so they talked about how that drive-through basically looked for different bottlenecks in terms of how they could more quickly serve people at a fast food restaurant. At first, they realized if they only have one ordering board, that only one person can order at a time. So that was a bottleneck. So they have people out there, and I don't know if folks have seen these at fast food. I know In-N-Out does this, Chick-fil-A does this, a couple of different fast food places do this. They have someone in the line of cars with little ordering, basically like little computers, little tablets, little something, little system so they can order the food. They can walk up to your car, order the food, boop, 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 it's in, even though your car is back in line a few people. So that gives you more time to, prep the food, have it ready so that when you get up to the window, you can just grab your food and go. Then they added taking payments through those same systems. So people can order, they can take payments from the people in the parking lot, kind of doing all these little pieces. So that sped things up even more. Then they realized at the fast food place that they needed to package the food faster. They were preparing it fast enough, but getting the orders packaged, like, oh, you got fries and a drink and blah, blah, blah. Getting all that packaged needed to go faster. So they redesigned the store on the internal part so they could more systematically package people's food products. So again, that was the next bottleneck that they had to work on to accelerate people moving through the line. And now they've looked at it and they realize that physically they can't pour drinks fast enough. That's the new bottleneck. Now that they have orders and payment being taken in the line of cars, they have a fast assembly and production line, but the physics of the drink machines were slow. It takes a certain amount of time to pour your Coke or whatever into the cup. So they're like, oh, we need to accelerate drink pouring, but you can't shoot it out of the machine faster. So you need more machines. Like, oh, wait, if we need more machines, we need more space. So they're in the process of tearing apart their kitchen to build a faster beverage service system at this drive-thru because they want to serve, their goal is to serve people quickly and that the people are happier faster. And so they showed an interesting little chart with the wait times for different restaurants. And you're like, oh, at fast food restaurants. Like, oh, Taco Bell has a really short wait time, but it also has fewer people in line usually. So your your time to be served is actually longer versus McDonald's, which may have an even longer wait time, but there's more people in line, so you move through faster, if this makes sense. Like you feel like you're making progress because you keep moving through versus Taco Bell where the wait time is shorter, but there's fewer people in line, so you actually feels slower. So the perception of how fast we feel like it's going matters to folks. And to have cars continually rolling forward makes things feel easier. He talked about also at the fast food restaurant when the line of cars gets to the road, people don't want to wait on the main road to turn into the restaurant. And so they need to move it fast enough so that people can keep getting in line but not have to wait on the road because that's a deterrent. People won't won't chill in their car on a busier main street waiting to get in. So that was their goal, to serve people faster. And now they're like, well, what's our next bottleneck? It's drink service, whatever it is. They're moving that to target the constraint, looking at what the specific bottleneck is. First, it wasn't ordering. They got ordering up to speed. Then it was packaging. Then they got packaging up to speed. Now it's drinks, and they're working on getting drinks to go even faster. And so being really thoughtful about what the actual constraint is and targeting that one thing can sometimes free up a lot of flow within the organization, a lot of making things easier, smoother, faster to reach those goals. And we're talking still about the goal of the goals sometimes too, to be thoughtful about the goals you're trying to reach. The last piece of finding leverage points is mapping the system. It sounds a little bit like go see the work, like you're trying to see what's happening, but the mapping the system means rise above the silos and spot promising targets for action. So this is not just the system within the organization. If they're like, oh yeah, we need to take orders faster. If you're just fixing faster ordering, cool. Like at the drive-thru, that might not connect with all the other pieces. And so that moving to the next bottleneck is part of it. But mapping the system means looking overall, at the bigger thing. And their example from this, for this section was a radiology clinic where people had to come in and get x-rays and get different types of imaging done at a hospital. And it felt slow and people were waiting. And they realized they were looking at the whole system of what everyone did within the system. And they found that some of the techs have to walk people back out to the main lobby. And they're like, well, that's this huge, long route to walk from the tech room back to the main lobby. Why don't we have someone else do that part? Then free up our techs to just provide imaging, more imaging services. And so they're like, oh, that's one thing we could work on. And this other thing they noticed that for some imaging, you need to take a contrast dye. So basically you need to drink this product so that the contrast shows up. It needs to sit in your system for a little while so that you can see organs or other blood flow or just things more clearly. So it's basically a dye that shows up on imaging scans. And they had people coming in and then nurse giving them the contrast dye. But they realized just because that had happened forever in the past, it wasn't a nurse. They didn't have to get checked in and then do this. They could just get checked in and have the staff in the lobby hand them their contrast dye. Oh, here you go, drink this, have a seat. So they didn't have to wait to see another person, basically, to get the contrast dye and to take another job. And the cost for that was a mini fridge that would sit in the the reception area so that people could get their dive faster. So by looking at the whole system, who was walking where, when, who was doing what part of what job, they could find overlaps of work or also work that wasn't really in alignment with the expertise of those people. We could use nursing staff in a much better way someplace else than handing someone something to drink. That is a contrast diet. Anyone could do that. So these were the 5 different find leverage point systems. Go see the work, consider the goal of the goal, study bright spots, target the constraint, and map the system. Basically, there's this beautiful overview of this book in this section that the curse of a bad set of habits is all the unnecessary things you are doing that come to seem necessary. So basically, people are cruising around doing all these very important, necessary things, but they're not. They're just sort of bad habits that people have. And he brings this quote up many times throughout the book. Making progress in meaningful work is the single most important thing that can boost emotions, motivation, and perceptions during the work day. So making progress in meaningful work is a thing that will boost motivation, emotions, and perceptions during the day. You can imagine doing habits of things that are not very useful, not very meaningful feeling, whether it's just walking someone to the door, or maybe it is important you need to walk people to the door, whatever it is. If it doesn't feel like you're being productive and meaningful in that work, then maybe that's not an important part of the system you need to be engaging with. Maybe it can be changed or altered. Maybe it's a leverage point, for example. He also talks about how glaring problems are sometimes a legacy of past solutions. He talks about a paper production plant, a cardboard box production plant, that all the machines shut down at 11:30 for lunch every day. And the consultant comes in and is like looking around. He's like, well, why does everything shut down at 11:30 for lunch? And they're like, oh, well, back in the day, as in 20 years ago, the power supply was erratic, especially around lunchtime for various reasons. So the changing power supply was really hard on the machines. So to protect the machines, they turned them off during lunchtime. What they hadn't quite caught on to was that power supply fluctuations had been fixed years ago. So there was no need to turn off the machines for lunch every day. And so productivity could be managed differently because they had this habit. They just had this habit of, well, this is how we do it here. We turn off the machines at lunch. That's just what happens. When in reality, that is a solution that they no longer needed to a problem they no longer had. Basically, long tolerated bad habits are leverage points. We have these bad habits of like, well, this is how it is. We have this habit of, chit-chatting for half an hour, then starting the meeting. Like, maybe that is just a bad habit. If you actually want things to get done during your meeting, maybe having 30 minutes of chit-chat is not optimal. Or changing the meeting so you have 30 minutes of chit-chat, then the meat of the meeting starts. Or chit-chat's optional, whichever it is. There are many solutions to a leverage point, which we're going to get into in the second part. He also talks about this in this section, that problems come from mistaking functional understanding for systemic understanding. Like, we think we know how things work. We don't actually understand the systems behind how things work. And you have these 2 beautiful examples. If you ask people to explain how the system of a toilet works, people are like, oh yeah, I push the handle and the waste goes down. Well, but how does it work inside? There's water tanks, there's a thing. How does it work? Like, we understand the functionality of it. We understand the functional pieces, but we don't actually, most of us, I will say, do not understand the system of the water pressure, where things go, how things are connected, why it works, essentially. Similarly, he said he had people draw a bicycle, and it had the outline of a frame with like handlebars, 2 wheels, and a piece of frame connecting. It's like, okay, draw on the chain and the pedals. People are like, it's here. I don't they drew some very not amazing designs. We'd say that were not functional bicycles. And some of those folks were like, oh yeah, I bike every day. But the way they drew, they didn't really understand how the bike worked in a systemic way. They understand like, oh, I push on the pedals and I go, and there's brakes, I steer. So even though people had a lot of functional understanding, they did not have systemic understanding. Yeah, basically we think because we use something, we know how it operates, we expect that we understand it, and we don't. We can operate things and we don't have any idea how they work. And also in this section, there's this little piece about how averages are great for monitoring, but terrible for diagnosis. He tells a story about how the military was like, oh, we'll make the average size cockpit for a plane that fits the average size person. And they had a Air Force fella came in. He's like, well, who's average? Let's look at that. And he measured, they had like 10, I don't know, they had more than 10. They had like 30, 40, a million different average things, like average arm length, average torso length, average leg length, average thumb length, for operating the different controls, average neck length, average height, average weight, average blah, 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 blah. They could not find any average person. This Air Force researcher was like, oh, it's time to update these averages or whatever. It was like, there's actually no one that fits any of these averages. Just because you have average arm length, you might not have average leg length, or you might not have average neck length and height. Like, you may have one piece of average, but he said no one had even 3 common average pieces of the average numbers. Like, so there really deeply is no average, but we can look at averages out there for monitoring things. Like, on average, things are happening at this rate or whatever, but averages are not great for diagnosis. To say like, oh, this airplane cockpit fits all pilots was not actually true. It fit some aspect of most pilots, but not multiple aspects of any pilot, right? Because no one shared, they designed it originally for the average of everything. No one fit any of those averages consistently across the board. Another piece of this first finding leverage points was also doing some actual journey mapping. I know this has become popular in times. Like, what is it like for someone who interacts with our organization from start to finish? What do they actually see or do? When they go to the website to buy the thing, what is that experience like? What happens? Not just thinking about it, but going through, oh, I need to click this thing. Oh, I need to click this other thing. Oh, I need to blah, 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 do these other pieces. And so the journey mapping is sort of a tool that they talk about a bit for figuring out what the client, the user, the student, whoever the sort of the target person for your services or your goods or whatever, what they actually experience going through the day. And that is part of seeing the work, and also mapping the system is where that fit in. So that's part 1, finding leverage points. Part 2, restack resources. This is reallocating time and effort to assess and push on those leverage points. You've identified some leverage points in part 1. It's amazing. All we need to do is fix everything. And you're like, cool. Well, what resources do we have? And they're coming, Dan Heath is coming from the perspective of, if you had a ton more resources just laying around, you probably would have done some of these things and tried them. Most likely you don't have just excess resources just out there in the world. So you need to reallocate the resources you already have. And this, there are several pieces, 6 different ways where this happens. One is, the first one is starting with a burst. And that is to begin with an intense and focused period of work. And so I know like sprints or hackathons, like there are sort of different pieces of this out there, but the burst is we're all going to concentrate on fixing this thing for sort of a distinctive, usually pretty short, but like a manageable piece of time. He talks about in some of these previous examples that they worked on this thing for a week. Like, we're all going to focus on the flow of clients through for our imaging clinic for 1 week. We're going to look at all these different pieces. We're going to spend a week on this. Then we're going to make some changes and move on with our life. So that was like a short burst. We're going to do this for a week. Or he tells another example of an organization that was like, we're going to have our key people talk about this for an hour a week for 12 weeks. Like, it was a very short, defined amount of time to do this journey mapping or do this process to figure out, well, what's actually happening? What are those leverage points? What do we need to do? So starting with a burst. Next is recycling waste. This is to discontinue efforts that don't serve the mission, which it sounds amazing. Like, I'm sure we're doing things that don't quite align. I talked a little bit previously about those habits that we inherit that are just bad habits. We don't know why. Like, if we wanted our box company to increase production, why are we turning down all the machines at lunchtime every day? Like, oh, it's just a habit that it's wasteful. It doesn't need our time anymore. And for those of you not in the world of change life, there is a waste. Let me define waste for you. Waste is anything that doesn't add value to your work in the customer's eyes. So not for you as the person delivering the work, but for the customer, the client, those people out there. There are 8 categories of waste. This may be familiar for some folks. Number 1 is defects. Number 2, overproduction. There is waiting, non-utilized talent, transportation, inventory, motion, and excess processing. So these are different ways waste comes into the system. For example, the cardboard box company, there was this huge waiting time just built in that was just wasteful for them. The machines were literally turned off for an hour or so every day. That was just waiting time that was added. That was a waste within the process. So and that acronym is downtime, all those things together: defects, overproduction, waiting, non-utilized talent, transportation, inventory, motion, and excess processing. I'll let you get into what each of those are. He kind of defines each of those a little more in the book. But the idea of, well, what is the waste we can recycle, not get rid of? How can we use that energy better? I think non-utilized talent is another beautiful one for folks in the nonprofit sphere. We know people out there. We know there are friends of the organizations oftenly that have some talent, have some ability, have some time, have some energy to devote to the cause, to the organization, but we're not utilizing those people. There's no system to help. Oh, we need someone to show up and go pick up some supplies for us across town. Like, oh, how do we do that? How do we find the person to do that? Oh, wait, we're going to have the CEO is just going to run over and grab that. Not a great use of the CEO's time to run and pick up supplies across town, right? That when that job could be done by someone else, so the CEO could utilize their talents as the CEO to build donor connections, do the meat of their job versus an aspect of their job that is they can do for sure, but it's not super relevant to the talents that they could offer the organization. So those are all super fun. The next way to restack resources is to do less and do more, which is shift resources from lower value work to higher value work. So there is some work that has a bigger impact than other work. Do more of the work that has more of the impact. Find ways to do less of the work that has no impact. And they sort of talk through the classic dilemma for many sort of service provider type organizations where you have some customers that are very high needs. They take a lot of time, they take a lot of attention. And you also have some customers that are very big customers. They are huge customers. They provide a lot of money, work. They're a big client, provide a lot of revenue for the organization. But those things don't always align. So if you have a very low value customer that takes more time to work with, then they're paying you to engage with them. They may not be a great customer. And that might mean either charging them more so that they're paying for the time and resources they take, or referring them out to someone who's a better fit. Or the classic firing your customers, which everyone loves to hear, is a really super fun concept. But if the idea being that the people that bring you the most revenue, and it's not all about revenue, by the way, I'll get to another example in a second, but the clients that are the most revenue in should have the most effort and attention and get the best experience from you, versus the clients that are just the squeakiest wheels. Like a squeaky wheel that's a high revenue client, great, work with that, it's worth it. The squeaky wheel that is a very low revenue client may not be worth it. So how do you figure this out? How do you sort out how to allocate your energy and resources better to do less and do more? On the flip side, he talks about this example of if something needs to happen, he tells this example of someone like a CEO who's at home and their wife is like, oh, hey, I need this part for the watering system for the garden. The garden needs to be watered. We're missing, this part is broken. Can you fix that up, get the part? And the CEO is like, well, I'm probably going to need another part from, I have to go to the store. But I'm probably going to need another part, something else from the store the next day or two, so I'll just put it off for 2 days. And meanwhile, the gardener is like, no, actually the plants need water. We need to do this now. So it may be more efficient to take an inefficient trip to the store for one small part, time, gas, all those things, to come back and have the garden be waterable and functional versus waiting a few days to, until there's 2 things or 3 things that need to be gotten from the store, then to cruise over and go get those. The goal is that these are things that are important in your client's eyes. So for you being efficient, oh yeah, obviously I want to go to the store when I need 10 things, not just 10 times for one thing. That may seem more efficient on your part, but the reality is maybe that one thing is a really important bottleneck in this whole process. And so it's worth it to put the effort in. Even though it's inefficient to go to the store for one thing, sometimes it's worth it to go to the store for one thing. So do less and do more. Caveat, it's not all about maximizing money in the end, is how that plays out. Next, the next way to restack resources is tap motivation, which is prioritize work required and desired. So what is it that people are excited about? Do more of that. It's harder, you may have seen or noticed, to have a great plan change initiative and try to get people on board, try to get people, when people say we need more buy-in, they're really, what they're saying is, I need more people to agree with me that this is how they should spend their time and effort and energy, money, blah, 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 blah. That's when people say they want buy-in, they want people to agree and do what they say, essentially, is what they're saying. The flip side of that is tapping motivation. What are people motivated or excited to do? How can we fit people in the right place to do things that is interesting and motivational to them? And how do we find the right people who want to do that thing or are interested in a piece of that thing? And then we can kind of add on other pieces with that. They sort of talk about a change initiative where they needed to, what was it? I think for this one, there's a library that was not doing well. Small town library in Texas, teeny town. Library wasn't great. It was dusty. The board meetings were all about how much money do we have to even keep this thing open. Why, it was on the decline, I would say, this library. And if they're talking about how much longer we can keep it open, probably nearing the end of the library. How many more months can we pay the rent, essentially, where the conversation's happening. They looked at they had this person came in, took on running. They were very motivated to save the library. They're like, oh yeah, I can take on managing this library board. Great. They're super motivated, super excited. They tried to figure out, the leverage points. Well, what does the library need to be? Oh, it needs to be a place for the community to use it and be involved there. Previously, the board had been derailed by renting out of meeting rooms. The library had meeting spaces. We can rent it out, but you can't bring in any shrimp because one time, many years ago, someone dropped a shrimp tank. It got clogged in the sink and it smelled terrible for 2 months, whatever it was. So this very big anti-shrimp in the library group. So if you wanted to rent the meeting room, you had this huge document that included you cannot bring in any shrimp. And the new boss that came in was like, well, I need to just simplify this. We need more people in here. We need more people knowing what's happening. People aren't actually using books. Let's for a library, heretical, let's throw a bunch of these books in a semi and get them out of here. We do not need this many books. We need a space for the community to use. So by being motivated and helping people engage with the library, and this, the new library board boss asked the different folks around, basically survey this town. I think the town is 3,000 people. It seems very small. Hey, what do you want from your library? What do you want to do here? Oh, you're excited about having a community garden at the library? Do it. And basically approved everyone's ideas and plans for the library, which they said later, not all the plans worked out well. People were really enthusiastic about the garden, but then it's sort of the watering and, tending to it, didn't play out. And so that didn't happen. But other people were like, oh, we want to create more of a maker space here. And that's been super popular. So now people can come and access, they had a library of things. It was another piece. I want to check out a leaf blower, or I want to check out a tire pump. I want to check out this other thing. So they engaged things that became super popular, things to check out from the library versus just books, because people were motivated. They asked for what they need and basically could deliver on what they need, but also got more volunteers and more people engaging because they were motivated, they were interested. So tapping that motivation versus, you can imagine the flip side of this, tapping motivation for the library versus I need people to buy in. And the buy-in side, I think we've seen this before, where someone has a fundraising effort. The library board could have been like, well, we just need to have fundraising. Let's go door to door and knock on everyone's door and ask for money to support the library. They could have done that. But the buy-in and motivation is so different when they ask, well, what do you want to do at the library? Let's make it happen. And different motivation, different level of engagement. And because of the engagement and support the library got from the community, is now a much better funded organization through the community government, because as where many libraries get their funding, because so many people are using it, so many people value it, so many people are like, we're going to vote for this resource in our community. So that is tapping motivation. The next one is let the people drive. Give your team the autonomy to lead the change effort. Oh yeah, sorry, I could read this probably better. Give your team the autonomy to lead the change efforts. Where can people make the decisions? And I would say make meaningful decisions toward making change happen. They talk about, I think in this one, there's a coach, I think an archery coach, who is very much do it this way, do this, very, sounds not super fun, but very authoritative as a coach. And these are Olympic athletes, so very high caliber, very high level athletes. And so they are deciding what coaches to take to the Olympic trials, the Olympics, I forget. And so there's room for 2 coaches. This is one of the coaches for the Olympic team, but the players get to vote on who to take to the Olympics, and they don't vote for this one coach. And that coach is like stung a little bit, like, oh, I was there every day, I was doing the work. But basically, people so did not like their coaching style that they didn't want them around. Like, great, you're the person who's gonna, tell me what to do and be like, do it, do it this way. This coach had realized, I think there was another thing where they didn't get chosen for something or something else happened. They realized they needed to retool their coaching style. So they got some training, developed, better skills as a coach, and now could approach their coaching instead of showing up and telling people what to do, like, oh, lift your elbow more, like, oh, tighten your forearm, like the specifics. They could engage with the archers in a much more athlete-driven way, which sounds fascinating. And so they give the example of the coach would show up and be like, hey, what do you want to work on today? And the archer would say, like, well, I want to work on my form of my right arm, for example. And then the coach would be like, okay, what are the things you want to work on with that? Like, well, I want to work on my positioning. I want to work on my, blah, 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 like a couple of different points. And the coach will say, great, show me what you're talking about. The archer will do something and be like, and then, fire a shot. And the coach would then say, well, how did this feel based on where you want to be versus where you are now? And the athlete will say, well, that was a 5 out of 10. And the coach can say, well, what are the things you need to focus on? And because they're an elite athlete, again, so there's a little caveat here that these are elite athletes who have an excellent mental model of what they want to have this thing look like. They could say like, oh, I need to position my arm like this better. I need to la, la, la. Like they knew, right? So the coach could support them in developing the very specific skills they needed for very elite competition. If you're trying to teach your 6-year-old cousin how to shoot a bow and arrow, most likely you will not show up and be like, hey, what do you want to do, kid? Like, well, they'll say, I want to shoot some arrows. They may need more direct instruction. I think there's some different ways to instruct versus coaching people, but being able to provide that excellent feedback is a good part of coaching versus let me just tell you what to do. So, and the way this looked like from the athlete's point of view was letting the people drive, letting those athletes drive their training and letting them drive their expertise and what they were working on versus coming in as a coach and just telling them, I will just tell you what to do. So let the people drive. And this is again where that quote came back around letting people make meaningful progress, like is what motivates folks. If they can see that they are making progress on meaningful work. And they couldn't see that if the coach was just like, great, move your arm faster. Great, position your arm over here. Great, position, blah, blah, blah. Like, I don't even think they said great. They're like, do this. Position your arm like this. Move your arm like this. Move your arm like that. Not as, there isn't that feedback loop that is, like, in reality, just poor teaching, poor education skills that does not let the people drive. And I think, for me, outside of this book, there's a very strong difference between facilitative approaches and experiential approaches and the didactic approach. Like I can tell you step by step how to do, how to paddle a canoe. Yes, I could definitely do that. But in reality, you're going to become a much better paddler if we get out on the water and I watch you paddle a little bit and give you some tips or ask you, hey, do you notice your boat's curving? Do you want your boat to go in a straight line? Most people will say yes at some point. Great. Let's talk about how to do that for a little bit. Let's work on that. So being an excellent facilitative educator, facilitative coach, facilitated consultant, whatever those pieces are really, I think, this piece of letting the people drive. So engaging with people as not oppressed beings, not the pedagogy of the oppressed is like your opposite, some Paolo Fieri, where you just need to show up and pour knowledge into these empty blank vessels. People are not empty blank vessels. They have the more autonomy and choice you can give them, the more they can drive, the more motivated they will be, and the better work they will do over time. So last, for restacking resources, we have accelerate learning. Get better, faster feedback to guide your work. So again, this ties into the last thing, being a good educator, but also how do you get fast enough feedback? They give this example of apparently in the 49ers football team, their stadium, they have these little kiosks around that are just happy face, kind of happy face, a little bit sad face, super sad face. So people can just hit a button as they cruise around. So they deploy these all over the stadium, outside of bathrooms, outside of vendors, just all over the place. And they convince the company to give them real-time feedback because they're only, the book talks about how there's only 10 different home games. So if they get a bunch of information, then they fix it over the next week. Like that's not fast enough because people are only there 10 times in a season. So they needed the feedback faster. So they have real-time feedback from places. And so they could see like, oh, there's a whole bunch of unhappy people by bathroom 42. The crew could be deployed to bathroom 42 and run over there and be like, oh yeah, there's a clogged toilet. Like, oh, they're out of paper towels. Like, cool, easy to fix. Versus having people just roam around looking for problems. Like they got the feedback fast enough that they could take action fast enough. Or like, oh, this vendor, people are saying sad face for the vendor. Like, oh, they're out of hot dog buns. Clearly, that's a slowdown that people don't like. They should, so they could respond faster. They did notice in getting fast feedback, though, that when the 49ers were losing a game, there was a lot more negative feedback. But when they were winning, there was far less negative feedback, mainly because when people were in a bad mood, like everything's terrible, like little things seem like bigger things. So then they learned to calibrate the feedback based on how well the team was doing on the field at any given time. Like, oh, for a losing game, we expect it to be, 15% negative feedback. Like, oh, for a really badly losing game, we expect 30% negative feedback, whatever it is. So they could calibrate, but also still find problems in the moment. And that is the way they accelerated learning. So they could get that better, faster feedback to guide the work. And I think there are other ways within organizations where they tell us another story of this CEO group coming up with this great plan to solve this problem of people who didn't get promoted. Like, oh, if they don't get promoted, we'll create this exchange program so they can go to another office, was their plan. And so Dan Heath tells the story of having a consultant came in and was like, oh, let's just do a little role play talk through. Like, you're the CEO, you're the person who didn't get hired. Just talk through offering this exchange program, pretend like you didn't get the promotion, so you're going to get this exchange program. And in that moment, they said two, different CEOs from different parts of the organization or different, bosses role play this. And as soon as the one was offered, like, oh yeah, you can exchange to a different office, that person was like, no, my kids are in school here. Are you saying my great department, I get to go work someplace was terrible? Like you said, I was a great office and blah, 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 blah. And they immediately realized that their huge plan of offering this exchange program was a terrible idea because people didn't actually view moving to a new location as a sign of appreciation. They're like, ugh, it's going to uproot my whole family. This is going to destroy the flow that I've gotten into here. And if I'm doing a good job, why don't I just keep doing a good job here? So accelerating learning also talks about getting some information, moving from the talk about it to the let's see what's actually happening phase out there. So those are the 6 ways to restack resources. Start with a burst, recycle waste, do less and do more, tap motivation, let people drive, and accelerate learning. Basically, at the end, he kind of wraps it up with, you get what you celebrate. He talks about this fun example of a CEO who just writes notes and notes and notes of appreciation every day to folks, which is great, celebrating people. And that testing is a replacement for guessing. It's not a replacement for judgment. So in that story where they had a million ideas and they needed to test them, they also needed to judge, well, this is actually a bad idea. It seems great, maybe. It seems great, like a great plan to go to the store only when you have 10 things to get from the store. But the judgment is like, oh, my clients, my constituent, the gardener in the family is going to be much happier and things are going to be much better if I go now, even though if it's just for one little piece. So that's like judgment versus testing. And guessing is really not useful for any of those. So, my people out there, this is Reset by Dan Heath. Super readable, super fun. Just to review one more thousandth of a time. 2 different things we were looking at in this book. Part 1, finding leverage points, going and seeing the work, considering the goal, studying the bright spots, target the constraint, map the system. And then part 2, restack resources, start with a burst, recycle waste, do less and do more, tap motivation, let people drive, accelerate learning. I see so many ways that so many of these ideas can be used. And there's tons of links to other books, other resources. I definitely have a section where I'm like, oh, I should do more, read some of these other original resources, read some other things, do a little more deeper dive into a couple pieces. So I'm curious about that myself personally. I hope this is useful for you when you think about how to change what's not working in the organizations and systems that you're a part of. We'll catch you next time. Thanks for joining us for this episode of the Books Applied podcast. I hope you enjoyed getting to know a new book and learning how to apply its ideas to make your work, sport, or life a little bit more awesome. For more leadership education-related content, including conflict management checklists, invitations to a fun free lunch that happens monthly, upcoming classes, webinars, and mastermind groups, please head over to wslleadership.com. Thanks, and have a great day.